At a gathering with my husband's family, they humiliated me in front of our 3-year-old son, and my husband sided with them. Either apologize to my mother, he said, or pack your things and get out of my life. Fine, I'll go, I replied. Then I picked up my son, got into the Porsche, and drove away. My mother-in-law ran after me, screaming, "Leave the car." She still thought the Porsche and the very house she was standing in front of belonged to her son. The next morning, my lawyer called him. I didn't look in the rearview mirror right away. I kept my eyes on the road out of that cul-de-sac, like it required navigating, though I'd driven it 100 times. My son was in his car seat behind me, still holding the paper plate he'd carried out with him. A single bite taken out of a hot dog he'd stopped caring about the second his grandmother started screaming, "Are we going home, Mommy? We're going somewhere for a little bit, baby." He accepted that the way 3-year-olds accept most things, which is to say completely, without asking a single follow-up question, and went back to looking out the window. I envied him for it. In the mirror, half a block back, I watched my mother-in-law standing in the middle of the street in her white sandals, one arm still raised like she could physically stop a car with the force of her outrage. She believed at that exact moment that she was watching someone drive off in her son's car, away from her son's house. She had believed it for 2 years. I had let her believe it because it was easier than the alternative, and because for 2 years I had convinced myself that whose name sat on a piece of paper in a filing cabinet didn't matter as much as whether everyone at the table was getting along. I understood, driving away from that house, that I had been wrong about that. I just didn't yet understand how wrong. I checked on my son again in the mirror. He'd fallen asleep with the paper plate still balanced on his lap, hot dog forgotten, mustard drying into a small yellow moon on his shirt. I let him sleep. I had 10 more minutes of driving before I had to decide what came next. And for those 10 minutes, I let myself just breathe, hands steady on a wheel that belonged to me, driving a road that led, eventually, to a hotel room and a phone call I'd been avoiding for 2 years without knowing it. The lawyer's name was already in my phone. I'd added it 8 months earlier after a different bad day and never called. I looked at the contact for a long time at a red light before deciding that whatever else happened tonight, I was done being the only adult in this family pretending a lie was small just because it was convenient. 5 years earlier, none of this had seemed like it was building toward anything. My husband and I met the ordinary way, through a coworker who thought we'd get along, and we did, easily, for a long time. He was funny in the specific way that made me feel funny too, like he brought something out of me I hadn't known was there. He remembered small things I said and brought them back weeks later. He was, for the first 2 years I knew him, exactly the kind of steady that I had never had growing up and didn't fully trust when I finally found it. His family was a different texture entirely. His father was quiet, the kind of quiet that read as either contentment or exhaustion depending on the day. His mother filled every room she was in without seeming to try, the sort of woman who could turn a sentence about the weather into a small performance, and who kept a mental ledger of every family member's accomplishments that she updated in real time. Her older son, my husband's brother, ran a successful practice 2 states over, and vacationed in the specific kind of places that generate photos other people compliment. I noticed early on that whenever my mother-in-law brought up the brother, my husband got quiet in a way he wasn't quiet about anything else. I didn't think much of it then. We married 2 years after we met, in a small ceremony that his mother had opinions about, and I mostly absorbed without arguing, because it was one day and I told myself it wasn't worth the friction. I moved him into the house I already owned. That detail seemed unremarkable to me at the time. It didn't seem unremarkable to his mother, who visited for the first time about 6 weeks after the wedding, and stood in the doorway of what was, by then, our kitchen, and said, to no one in particular, but clearly for my husband's benefit, "You've done so well for yourselves. This is a beautiful home." My husband said thank you. Not, "This was mine before we met." Not, "I moved in." Not, "My wife bought this." Just thank you. Delivered with the small, pleased smile of a man accepting a compliment that was, technically, aimed in his direction, and technically, not a lie yet, because his mother hadn't asked a direct question, and he hadn't volunteered a direct answer. I remember standing at the sink with my back to both of them, waiting for him to correct her, the way you wait for a stumble to resolve itself before you decide whether to reach out and catch someone. He didn't correct her. And later that night, when I asked him about it, lying in bed with the light already off, he said the sentence that would define the next 2 years of my life without either of us realizing it yet. "She's proud of me," he said. "Why would I take that away from her over paperwork?" The house had come from my grandmother, who raised me for most of my adolescence during a stretch when my own mother wasn't in a position to. It wasn't large or impressive in the way that would have mattered to my mother-in-law. It was a 4-bedroom colonial with a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 90s, and a staircase that announced every footstep, worth something mostly because of who had lived in it, not what it was made of. My grandmother left it to me outright when she died, along with a small piece of land outside the city that I sold 2 years later, while I was still single, for enough money to pay off what remained of my student loans and put a healthy amount into savings. What was left over, I used to buy a certified pre-owned SUV outright. No loan, no financing, nothing that required anyone's name but mine. I remember the finance manager at the dealership double-checking that I really intended to write a single check for the full amount, like it was an unusual enough request that he wanted to make sure I understood what I was doing. An estate attorney had walked me through all of this before I ever met my husband, back when I was closing out my grandmother's affairs. She was blunt in a way I appreciated then and would appreciate even more later. "Keep it separate," she told me. "Don't put anyone else's name on the deed no matter how serious the relationship gets. Don't take out a joint loan against it. Don't let it become part of a shared account. If the marriage is good, none of this will ever come up, and if it's not, you'll be glad you listened." I followed her advice to the the letter, not because I anticipated needing it, but because it seemed like reasonable due diligence, the kind of thing a responsible adult does with an unexpected inheritance, regardless of what her love life looks like. Both purchases, the house and the vehicle, happened well before I ever brought my husband home to meet my grandmother's old dining room table. The deed had my name on it and only my name. The title to the vehicle was the same. There was no mortgage, no lien, no joint anything for anyone to misunderstand, which is what made it so strange that within 6 weeks of moving in, my husband had already let his mother believe he was the one who had provided all of it. Not through some elaborate scheme, just through silence, held at exactly the moment when the truth would have taken less effort to say than the lie did to maintain. I told myself it was a small thing, the kind of harmless vanity every family runs on in one form or another. What I didn't yet understand was that a lie like that doesn't stay small. It has to be fed a little more each year, or it collapses under its own weight, and someone always ends up doing the feeding. Over the next 2 years, the lie fed itself in small, unremarkable increments, each one easy to excuse on its own. At a neighborhood barbecue the first summer we were married, a neighbor mentioned to my husband in passing what a smart buy the house had been given, how the market had moved since. My husband said something modest about getting lucky with timing. He didn't say it wasn't his purchase to begin with. I stood 4 feet away holding a bowl of coleslaw and said nothing either, because correcting him in front of a neighbor felt like a bigger scene than letting an ambiguous sentence pass. Somewhere in the second year, I stopped waiting for him to correct people and started simply absorbing the discomfort myself, telling myself it was a small price for peace. When his mother mentioned, at a holiday dinner, how nice it must be for him to drive such a beautiful car, I actually opened my mouth to correct her that time. My husband put his hand over mine on the table, not urgently, just a light pressure, and said, "Let her have this. It makes her happy," quietly enough that only I could hear it. I asked him once, not long after that dinner, whether it bothered him that I was the one holding my tongue every time this came up. He said he didn't see it that way. He said it wasn't like he was actively lying to anyone, he just wasn't going out of his way to correct an assumption, and what was the harm in that really, when the alternative was making his mother feel smaller in front of people she wanted to impress. I didn't have a good answer for him that night, or if I did, I didn't say it because saying it out loud would have required admitting something I wasn't ready to admit yet, that I had married a man who would rather let his wife carry the weight of a lie indefinitely than risk one uncomfortable minute with his mother. By the time we reached his father's retirement, I had absorbed enough of these moments that I'd stopped counting them individually. They had become weather, something you dressed for rather than something you fought. The cookout was for my father-in-law's retirement, held in his and my mother-in-law's backyard on a Saturday that had turned out warmer than the forecast promised. I'd spent most of the week helping plan it. In between my actual job and a training weekend, I'd had to shuffle around to make the date work, and I arrived that afternoon with 2 folding tables worth of side dishes and the particular fatigue of someone who has done most of the invisible labor for an event that other people will simply enjoy. My mother-in-law met me at the gate with a hug that felt more like an inspection, her eyes moving over my dress before they landed back on my face. "That's a nice dress," she said. "New? A few years old, actually." "Well, it looks expensive." She said it lightly, the way you'd say something looks like it's going to rain, but there was a small measuring quality underneath it that I'd learned to recognize over 5 years of these events. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was closer to an audit. My husband was already at the grill with his father, both of them in the specific companionable silence of men who communicate mostly through handing each other tools. My son found his cousins near the swing set within about 90 seconds of arriving, the way small children do, and disappeared into a game that seemed to involve a great deal of running and no discernible rules. For the first hour, things were fine. Better than fine, even. My father-in-law seemed genuinely lighter than I'd seen him in years, freed from a job that had worn on him longer than it should have. Relatives I only saw a few times a year caught me up on their lives. I let myself relax into the ordinary rhythm of a family gathering, the kind where nothing needs to be managed or absorbed, just enjoyed. It was somewhere in the second hour that my mother-in-law found her audience and her opening. She'd had 2 glasses of wine by then, enough to loosen whatever restraint usually kept her comments contained to a private murmur rather than a performance for the yard. I heard her, from across the patio, telling my husband's aunt how generous her son had been, giving the whole family a place to gather like this, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that I'd learned to manage by simply not looking over. I didn't look over. I told myself, the way I always did, that it would pass, that the moment would dissolve into the next moment the way it always had, and that the smartest thing I could do was keep arranging deviled eggs and let it dissolve without my help. I was wrong about that too, though I wouldn't understand how wrong for another 20 minutes. The next comment came when I carried a bowl of potato salad past the group my mother-in-law was holding court with. She looked at the bowl, then at me, and said, loudly enough for the whole cluster of relatives to hear, "You know, some women would hire a caterer for something like this. It's sweet that you still do it all yourself." A cousin laughed, unsure whether it was a compliment or not, which was, I'd come to realize, exactly the effect my mother-in-law was going for. Comments that could be defended as kind if anyone objected, but that landed every time with a small blade folded inside them. I set the bowl down and said something neutral about liking to cook, and moved on before the conversation could develop further, because engaging with her in front of an audience never went anywhere I wanted it to go. I glanced toward the grill. My husband had heard it. I could tell from the particular way he was suddenly very focused on a hamburger that didn't need that much attention. He didn't look up, he didn't say anything. He had perfected, over 5 years, a kind of selective deafness that let him remain technically present for these moments without ever ever participating in them. And I understood, watching him flip that hamburger with more concentration than the task required, that he had made his choice, the one he always made. Keeping his mother comfortable was worth more to him than making me comfortable, as long as my discomfort stayed quiet enough not to disturb the day. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for what came later. I wasn't blameless in how long this had gone on. I had let 2 years of small moments pass without forcing a real reckoning, because a real reckoning felt exhausting, and I told myself over and over that avoiding it was the mature choice. I see now that what I was actually doing was training everyone around me, including myself, that I would absorb almost anything rather than make a scene. My mother-in-law hadn't invented that dynamic out of nothing. She had noticed, the way people who need an audience always notice, exactly how far she could go before I pushed back. And she had spent 2 years testing that boundary a little further each time, the way water finds every gap in a foundation before anyone thinks to check for cracks. That afternoon, she found the gap that mattered. I didn't see it coming, not really, even though in hindsight every single thing that happened in the 10 minutes before it should have told me. She'd had her wine, she had her audience, and she had noticed, over 5 years, that there was exactly one subject that could make me stop absorbing things quietly, and it wasn't the money, and it wasn't the house, and it wasn't even her tone with me directly. It was my son. She crossed the yard toward the swing set where my son had paused between rounds of whatever game he and his cousins had invented, and she crouched down in front of him, smoothing his hair back from his forehead, and I watched from the patio without any particular alarm, because this, at least, looked like an ordinary moment of affection. Then she spoke, and she spoke loudly, in the specific pitch of someone who wants to be overheard while appearing to be speaking privately to a child. "One day," she said, "you'll understand that your father worked very hard to give you all of this. This house, that beautiful car outside. You're a very lucky boy to have a father who provides so well for his family." My son looked at her with the polite, uncomprehending patience of a 3-year-old being told something adult and abstract, nodding the way he nodded at most things he didn't fully understand, and went back to looking at the swing set, already losing interest. I did not have his patience. I set my glass down on the table hard enough that a few people glanced over, and I said across the yard, clearly enough that there was no ambiguity about who I was addressing, "Please don't tell him things that aren't true." The yard went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everyone has been pretending not to listen, and suddenly can't pretend anymore. My mother-in-law rose from her crouch slowly, deliberately, the posture of someone absorbing a blow in front of witnesses and making sure everyone sees exactly how much it hurt. "After everything this family has done for you," she said, her voice carrying easily across the yard, "you choose today, of all days, to disrespect me, in front of everyone, at his own retirement." "I'm not trying to disrespect you," I said. "I'm asking you not to tell my son something false. Something false." She said it like the words themselves offended her. "I have watched my son provide for this family for 5 years. I've watched him work himself into the ground so his wife and son could have a beautiful home and a beautiful car, and now I'm not even allowed to acknowledge it." I looked past her toward the grill, waiting, the way I had waited 100 small times over 5 years for my husband to say something, to correct her, to do, in this one moment in front of the entire family, what he had never once done in private. He didn't move toward the grill this time. He set down the tongs, and he started walking toward us. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, a hope I hadn't let myself fully name until that second, a hope that this was finally the moment he chose me. He walked past me. He went and stood beside his mother. The whole yard was watching by then. My father-in-law had come around from the grill area with a spatula still in his hand, looking between his wife and his son and me like a man trying to work out which direction the ground was about to give way in. My husband's aunt had gone very still. Even the cousins had stopped their game near the swing set, sensing, the way children always sense these things faster than adults expect, that something had shifted. My husband stood beside his mother, and he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, or maybe had seen 100 times in smaller versions and never let myself name for what it was. It wasn't anger exactly. It was closer to embarrassment, the specific embarrassment of a man watching his wife cause a scene in front of an audience he cared about impressing, and it told me, in that one look, exactly how he had weighed the situation, and exactly where I had landed in it. "Apologize to my mother," he said. I looked at him for a long moment, giving him every chance I could think to give a person to reconsider a sentence before it became unretractable. He didn't reconsider. If anything, my hesitation seemed to firm his resolve, the way silence sometimes reads as defiance to a person who's already decided how the conversation is going to go. "Either apologize to my mother," he said, "or pack your things and get out of my life." I want to describe what that sentence did to me honestly, because I've turned it over 1,000 times since. It didn't shatter me the way I might have expected. What it did was colder and clearer. It organized everything. 2 years of small silences resolved suddenly into a single fact. My husband had just told an entire yard full of his family that his mother's comfort mattered more to him than his wife's dignity, using the exact language of an ultimatum in front of our son. "Fine," I said. "I'll go." I don't remember consciously deciding what to do next. I remember crossing the yard to where my son had wandered back toward the patio, drawn by the sudden quiet, and I remember lifting him up onto my hip, the paper plate with his half-eaten hot dog somehow still in his other hand, and I remember walking past every single relative at that party, every one of whom had gone very interested, very suddenly, in the contents of their own drink. Nobody stopped me. Nobody said a word. I got to the Porsche, buckled my son into his car seat with hands that were steadier than I expected, and pulled away from the curb. That's when my mother-in-law came running. "Leave the car!" she screamed, chasing us down the driveway in her sandals, one hand raised as though sheer volume could bring a moving vehicle to a stop. I watched her in the mirror, getting smaller, still certain in that moment that what she was witnessing was a wife driving off in her son's car, walking away from a house her son had generously built a life around. She had no idea, standing in that street, exactly how wrong she was. Neither really did I, not yet, about how deep the wrongness went. The hotel I chose was 10 minutes from the house, close enough that I could get my son back to his own bed the next day if this resolved itself quickly, far enough that I wouldn't run into anyone from that yard by accident that night. I checked in with a credit card that had only my name on it, a detail that struck me as almost funny given everything that had just happened. Everything that actually belonged to me had my name on it. It always had. The problem had never been the paperwork. The problem had been who I'd let believe otherwise, and for how long, and why. My son fell asleep almost immediately once we were in the room, worn out from the running and the shouting and the general disruption to a Saturday that was supposed to have been about hot dogs and cousins and nothing more complicated than that. I sat on the edge of the second bed and watched him sleep for a while, still in his little sneakers, one hand curled loosely near his face, and I let myself feel, for exactly as long as it took to watch him breathe through 10 or 12 breaths, the full weight of what had just happened. Then I got up because feeling the weight of it wasn't going to solve anything, and I had a decision to make about what came next. I texted my husband first. I told him where we were. I told him he could video call anytime he wanted to see our son, that whatever else was happening between the two of us, I wasn't going to use our child as a weapon or a bargaining chip, because I still believed, even in that moment, that there was a version of this that could end without turning into a war. I didn't get a response. I put the phone down and picked it back up twice in the next 20 minutes, checking, and both times there was nothing. It was somewhere in that waiting that I opened the contact I'd saved 8 months earlier and never used. I'd added her after a friend recommended her, back when a different bad night had made me wonder, just for an evening, whether I needed to understand my own legal footing better than I did. I'd closed the browser tab that night without calling. I told myself the marriage was fine. I told myself I was being paranoid, letting one bad evening spiral into a worst-case scenario that wasn't actually coming. Sitting in that hotel room with my son asleep 6 feet away, I understood that I hadn't been paranoid 8 months earlier. I'd been early. The only thing that had changed since then was that I'd finally run out of road. I called her a little after 9 that night. She picked up on the third ring, and when I finished explaining what had happened, there was a pause on her end that told me, before she said a single word, that this was going to be bigger and slower than a single apology could fix. "I'll call him first thing tomorrow morning," she said, "before you talk to him again. I want him to hear this from me first, in a context where he has to actually listen instead of just reacting." I agreed. I didn't fully understand yet what I was agreeing to set in motion. My lawyer called him at 9 the next morning, exactly as she'd said she would. She called me 15 minutes after she hung up with him, and I could hear, in the measured way she chose her words, that she'd spent that 15 minutes deciding how much detail to give me. "He's angry," she said, "but he listened. That matters more than it sounds like it does." She told me she'd kept the call brief and professional, the way she always did on a first contact. She'd told him I had retained counsel regarding a temporary separation, the preservation of shared finances, and a written parenting schedule for our son. She'd told him that neither the house nor the vehicle could be sold, borrowed against, or transferred to anyone else while questions about ownership were being reviewed, and she'd suggested, in the same calm tone she used for everything, that he take a close look at the deed and the title before he continued describing either asset as his own in front of family. "How did he take that part?" I asked. "There was a very long silence," she said. "Longer than I expected." I sat with that for a while after we hung up. 5 years of a man accepting compliments for a house and a car he'd never paid a single dollar toward, and it had taken a single sentence from a lawyer he'd never met to introduce, apparently for the first time, the idea that the paperwork existed and might eventually be looked at by someone other than me. He called me 2 minutes after that. I know it was 2 minutes because I was still looking at the screen when his name came up. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Faster and smaller at the same time. The voice of a man who has just watched a door he assumed was load-bearing turn out to be decorative. "You can't just take my son and everything I own," he said, before I'd even said hello. I told her the truth. I said, "I'd like you to do the same, for once. You're turning one bad afternoon into a legal war." "No," I said. "Your mother humiliated me in front of our son, and you told me to apologize to her or leave your life. I'm handling what comes after that responsibly. That's not a war. That's just consequences arriving on a schedule you didn't expect." He didn't have an answer for that right away. I could hear him breathing on the other end, the particular quality of breath a person has when they're recalculating something in real time. "Why?" I asked into the silence. "Does your mother think she has the right to throw me out of my own house?" The silence that followed that question lasted long enough that I almost asked if he was still there. "It's complicated," he finally said, his way of stalling long enough to decide how much of the truth he could get away with giving me. "Uncomplicated," I said. What came out in pieces over the next 20 minutes was a version of the last 5 years I'd never heard him say out loud, though I'd suspected the shape of it for a long time without ever having it confirmed. He told me how tired he'd gotten over the years of his mother's habit of measuring him against his older brother in every conversation. The brother with the successful practice and the vacations and the new car every 2 years. The brother who had apparently become a kind of ambient standard his mother applied to every accomplishment my husband ever mentioned to her. Every time I told her something good, he said, she'd find a way to compare it to something my brother had done bigger. New job, she'd ask if it paid as well as his. Knew anything, she'd wonder out loud if it was as nice as what he had. I got so tired of it. "So you lied to her." "I didn't set out to lie," he said. "It just happened. One Sunday early on, she was going on about how beautiful the house was, and I just said thanks, I bought it right before the wedding, like it was nothing, like it was a throwaway line. And her whole face changed. She looked at me like I'd actually accomplished something that measured up. I hadn't felt that from her in years. I know how that sounds. It sounds, I said, like you decided your mother's approval was worth more than my name being said correctly in my own house. He didn't argue with that, which told me, more than anything he'd said up to that point, that he knew it was true. There's more, he said, after a pause that told me he'd been dreading this next part more than everything before it. The car. When she assumed it was an anniversary gift I'd given you, I never corrected that either. I let her believe I'd bought you a Porsche. I let that sit for 2 years. I sat with that for a moment. The specific vertigo of learning that a lie you'd already forgiven once had a second, larger version underneath it that you hadn't been told about. What else? I said. Haven't you corrected? The guest suite, he said, quietly enough that I almost missed it. A few months ago, my parents started talking about selling their place once his retirement made the upkeep feel like too much. I told them they could stay with us while they looked for something smaller. I told them that before I ever mentioned it to you. I let that sit in the silence between us for a moment because I wanted him to feel the full weight of what he'd just admitted, rather than have me rush in and soften it for him the way I always had. You offered them a room in my house, I said, without asking me. I thought you'd come around. They're my parents. So you made a unilateral decision about who lives in my home, and your plan for handling my objection was to present it after it was already a promise you'd made to 2 other adults. He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said, I know how this all sounds, laid out like this. It doesn't just sound bad, I said. It is bad. You've spent 2 years building an entire version of yourself for your family that's constructed almost entirely out of things that belong to me. The house, the car, now a room in that same house that you promised to your parents without a conversation. At some point, this stops being about protecting your mother's feelings and starts being about who you actually are when nobody's checking. He apologized then, in the specific tone people use when they're apologizing for getting caught rather than for the thing itself. And then, almost in the same breath, he asked a question that told me exactly how little of this he'd actually absorbed. Can you just apologize to her, he said, so we can put this behind us and figure the rest out at home? I sat there for a long moment with the phone against my ear, my son asleep on the other bed, and I understood that he still believed, even after admitting to all of it, that the actual problem was a hurt feeling that could be smoothed over with the right words, rather than a pattern he'd built brick by brick over 2 years that had just, for the first time, been named out loud. You still think the problem is that her feelings got hurt? I said, and I hung up before he could answer. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after that, watching my son breathe in his sleep, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel yet, which was less like anger and more like a very specific, very cold kind of dread. Not about the lie itself, about how easily he'd built it, and how long it had taken me to actually see the size of it, and what that might mean about the parts I still hadn't seen. I asked my lawyer the next afternoon to help me review our joint accounts before I made any further decisions about the marriage. I expected, going into it, to find ordinary things, a few purchases he'd forgotten to mention, maybe, the kind of small financial blind spots that exist in almost every long relationship. I did not expect what actually came back. The first 16 months of statements arrived by early evening, and it took less than 20 minutes of scrolling to notice the pattern, once I knew to look for it. Small transfers out of our joint savings, dated irregularly but recurring often enough to form a shape once you laid them side by side. $300 here, labeled home repair. $800 there, labeled car payment, though we had no car payment. A handful simply labeled dad, as though the label itself had been an afterthought, typed in quickly by a man who didn't expect anyone else to ever look closely enough to ask. I sat at the small hotel desk with my laptop and did the math twice, because the total the first time seemed too large to be real. Across 16 months, the transfers added up to just under $12,000, moved quietly out of an account that was meant for emergencies, for our son's future, for the kind of repairs a 100-year-old roof eventually needs. None of it had ever been discussed with me. None of it had ever appeared as a line item in any conversation we'd had about money. And we had, over 5 years, had a great many conversations about money. I called him that evening once my son was settled with a video and a snack, and I read the total out loud before he had a chance to say anything else. $12,000, I said, over 16 months, to your parents, without a single conversation with me about any of it. He didn't deny it. That at least told me something had shifted in him since the morning's call. Some recognition that denial was no longer a strategy that would survive contact with an actual bank statement. My parents were struggling, he said. Dad's retirement took longer to come through than they expected, and the roof on their place started leaking last winter. I knew what you'd say if I asked. That sentence landed harder than the number had. He hadn't forgotten to mention $12,000 over 16 months. He had made a specific, repeated decision, more than a dozen separate times, that my answer didn't matter enough to ask for. I need you to understand, I said, that I'm not upset because your parents needed help. I would have helped them if you'd asked me, the same way I've helped my own family when they needed it. I'm upset because you decided over and over for a year and a half that keeping this from me was easier than having one uncomfortable conversation. He was quiet on the other end for a long moment. Then he said something that I filed away without fully understanding, at the time, how important it would turn out to be. There might be a few other things in those statements, he said, that I should probably explain before you find them yourself. And I asked him what he meant by that, and he backed off almost immediately, saying something vague about a few small charges he'd forgotten to flag, nothing significant. And I let it go that that night because I was tired in a way that went past physical exhaustion into something closer to grief, and I didn't have the capacity to chase down every loose thread in a single conversation. But the sentence stayed with me. It sat in the back of my mind the way an unfamiliar sound in a house sits with you after you've told yourself it was probably just the pipes settling. The next morning, going through the statements more carefully with my lawyer on a scheduled call, I noticed something I'd skimmed past the first time. A small fee, $22, labeled only with a bank code I didn't recognize, dated about 3 weeks before the cookout. I asked my lawyer if she knew what it was. She didn't recognize it immediately either, but she said something that stuck with me for the rest of that call. Banks charge fees like that for a few specific reasons, she said. Sometimes it's an overdraft, sometimes it's a wire transfer fee, and sometimes, she paused, choosing her next words carefully, it's associated with a loan application, a processing or underwriting fee, that kind of thing. We haven't applied for any loans, I said. Not that I know of. Would you know? She asked if he had. I sat with that question longer than I wanted to admit. The honest answer, given everything I'd learned in the last 3 days, was that I no longer had any confidence in what I would or wouldn't know about my own husband's financial decisions. $12,000 had moved through our joint account over 16 months without my noticing a pattern, because I trusted him, because I hadn't been looking for a pattern, because you don't audit a marriage the way you audit a stranger. I don't know, I said. I genuinely don't know anymore. I'd like to request a formal review, she said. Given that ownership of the property is already in dispute, it's standard practice at this point to pull a full title history and check for any liens, applications, or encumbrances filed against it in the last year. It's a routine step. It usually comes back clean. I told her to go ahead. I remember saying it almost casually, the way you agree to a formality you don't expect to change anything, because at that point I still believed the worst of what I was dealing with was a man who'd let his mother believe a comfortable lie and quietly funneled money to his parents without asking me. I believed that morning that I already understood the full shape of what I was up against. I did not yet understand the shape of it at all. While the title review was pending, the rest of the family made their positions known, and none of them made me feel better about where this was heading. My mother-in-law called a cousin, who called another cousin, who eventually texted me directly to ask, with the bluntness of someone repeating gossip they hadn't fully thought through, whether it was true I was trying to take the house away from my husband out of spite. I typed out 3 different responses and deleted all of them, because nothing I said in a text was going to undo the version of events already circulating in a family group chat I wasn't part of. My father-in-law called me instead, later that same evening, and his voice sounded older than it had at his own retirement party 3 days earlier. Your mother-in-law says the house is his, he said. He says it isn't, and now I'm hearing there was money moved from your account to ours that I didn't know the full story on either. I think this family needs to hear the whole thing, start to finish, from him, not from whispers. I told him I agreed, and that I'd meet with all of them once in a neutral location on the condition that my husband was the one who explained everything himself in front of everyone, rather than letting me carry the burden of exposing him. My father-in-law agreed. We set a date for the following week. I should have felt some relief arranging that meeting. Instead, the days leading up to it were dominated by a growing unease I couldn't fully name, a sense that something underneath all of this hadn't surfaced yet. My lawyer called twice during that stretch with brief updates that amounted to not yet, still processing, county records can be slow, and each time I hung up feeling less reassured rather than more, the particular anxiety of waiting for a test result you've already started to suspect isn't going to be good news. My son, for his part, adjusted to the hotel with the easy resilience of a 3-year-old who mostly cared whether the pool was open and whether pancakes were still on the breakfast menu. He asked once, unprompted, whether we were going to see his grandmother again soon, and I told him we would, eventually, once the grown-ups sorted some things out, and he accepted that answer the way he accepted most things, without pressing further, and went back to stacking the little paper cups from the bathroom into an increasingly unstable tower on the nightstand. I envied him for that, the way I'd envied him in the car 3 days earlier. He got to exist in a version of this where nothing had actually changed yet. I did not have that luxury anymore, and I understood, watching the title review sit unresolved for a 4th day, that I was about to lose it entirely. The call came on the 5th day, a little after 2 in the afternoon. My lawyer's voice had a different quality than it had on any of the previous calls, a careful flatness I recognized from 5 years of watching my husband deliver bad news slowly, as the sound of someone deciding how much to say before they'd finished deciding it. The title came back clean, she said. No liens, no judgments, nothing recorded against the property itself, but the review turned up something else. A home equity application, filed with a regional lender using the house as collateral. It was submitted 3 weeks before the retirement party. I asked her what that meant, though some part of me had already started assembling the shape of it before she finished her sentence. An application like that requires the signature of every owner on the deed, she said. Since your name is the only one on it, the application should have needed only your signature. I'm looking at the file the lender sent over right now, and there's a signature on it, she said, dated 3 weeks before the cookout. It has your name typed underneath it. I sat very still on the edge of the hotel bed. The phone pressed hard enough against my ear that it would leave a small mark I'd notice later in the mirror and not remember getting. I didn't sign anything, I said. I've never even seen paperwork like that I would remember. I believe you, she said, and there was something in how quickly and plainly she said it that told me she'd already suspected this before she called, had maybe suspected it since the $22 fee first surfaced, and had been building toward this moment as gently as the facts allowed, which means someone else provided a signature signature under your name on a legal document to a lender requesting funds against a property you own outright. The application also lists a notary acknowledgement. Someone stamped this as witnessed. I asked her the amount. She told me. It was almost exactly the figure that would have covered a down payment on a smaller place. The exact conversation he'd mentioned to me only in passing. Weeks after this application had apparently already been filed, as though he'd been planning to solve the problem quietly, permanently, without ever telling me it existed, using a house that had never once had his name on it. 3 weeks before the cookout, before the argument in the yard, before any of the moments I'd spent the last 5 days replaying, trying to understand how a small, comfortable lie about who owned a house had curdled into something this large. I had been building a timeline where the lie simply grew, year over year, fed by convenience and pride and a man's fear of disappointing his mother. That timeline was wrong. The lie hadn't just been growing on its own. Somewhere in those 2 years, it had stopped being something he merely allowed to happen, and had become something he actively engineered, with paperwork, with a signature that wasn't mine, with a stamp from a notary who had apparently watched someone else sign my name and decided not to ask any questions. I need you to send me everything, I said. The application, the signature page, all of it. I'll have it to you within the hour, my lawyer said. Then, after a pause, more gently than she'd said anything else on that call, I want to be clear about what we're actually looking at here. This isn't a family disagreement about who gets credit for a house anymore. I already knew that. I'd known it the second she said the word notary. My son was on the floor of the hotel room, 3 feet away, stacking his paper cups into a tower that had finally, after 4 attempts, managed to reach 6 cups high, and he looked up at me, delighted, waiting for me to notice. I made myself smile at him. I made myself say, "Good job, baby," in a voice that didn't shake. Then I sat there holding the phone, staring at the wall, waiting for the email to arrive with my own name signed in someone else's handwriting.